Welcome, dear friends of the faculty, dear colleagues, dear international advisors, dear ladies and gentlemen, to this event on a very fancy title this evening. Thank you for coming. I think it's not normal that you are coming in three consecutive events. We can welcome so many persons listening what the Faculty of Informatics is doing. This is the third event in a sequence of public events we had in the last 2 months. The first one was on Bachelor with Honors. It was the inaugural event on the Bachelor with Honor. The second one was 2 weeks ago on the future of computing, where our new colleagues, newly appointed colleagues, were discussing about their point of view, how the future of computing will evolve. And today we have the fancy title of Living in the Cyberworld, the Land of Humans and Artificial Intelligence. It's really a discussion, a presentation, started by a presentation and then a discussion, let's say, about the future of mankind in interaction with technology, mainly information technology. How will our future look like? It's really important questions. We should approach the future not having fear. We should be courageous, but we should also look at the pitfalls. We should look what's coming up and actively address the issues which are in front of us. There's a second major point we want to stress with this respect. These three events have one motto, one thematic parenthesis, which is excellence and responsibility. I think we have to be, as informatics faculty, we have to be excellent in all different areas, teaching and research. And this is our responsibility we have in the Austrian and also European research and science ecosystem. This is how we understand responsibility in this context. The panelists, and they will be introduced afterwards by Georg Gottlob, are members of our International Advisory Board. We have established an advisory board at the Faculty of Informatics at TU Wien to have interesting discussions, okay? This is it makes fun to discuss with them. But the issue is a more fundamental one, besides having fun and having interesting discussions with them. We seek their advice on the future of informatics, how a faculty, how a department should address the future of informatics. And this is not something we can only discuss in Vienna or in Austria, or we can discuss within our little faculty or within the technical university, so important it is. It's more important to look abroad and to invite colleagues worldwide, and those 5 members of our advisory board coming from the US, Asia and Europe, and they will be introduced later, they give us their strategic advice on issues how to tackle interdisciplinarity. A major point for computer science or informatics as a fundamental discipline where we can approach with computational thinking on a methodological level many problems we have today. And we are outreaching to other areas and other disciplines. How should we organize teaching in 5 years? Will it be sufficient to have teaching silos with one study program beside the other one? Or should we have a teaching program where students, guided by mentors, can decide and assemble it related to real societal challenges? How should this be organized? And the last issue is computer science not only has an impact on science, how it is done, but also on applications. Maybe we are today the science which has the most direct impact on society, economy in general. So a faculty taking serious the issue of excellence in this area has to treat the issue of societal impact. What is the relationship? And this is where we also look for advice from our international colleague, where they are really discussing with us every year for 2 days our strategic plans, providing input, and also criticizing fundamentally what we do. But this is part of an academic tradition, to take comments, criticism, and to improve. The evening is organized as follows. I will hand over now to the moderator, and he will then introduce the panelists. I am happy that Georg Gottlob, who is a colleague of us, he has a double appointment, University of Oxford, professor for computing, so it's a more generic, even more than computer science, it's computing. And at the same time, he has an appointment at our university, coming from our university on database and artificial intelligence. And he's probably one of the most important pillars, stones. We are building our faculty and also computer science in Austria, or informatics in Austria. And I would ask Georg to come out and to take over from me, and I thank you very much for taking this responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean, or Spectabilis, yeah, as it is the official title here. So let me say I will not introduce all the panelists now. Let me start by introducing Edward Lee, Professor Edward Lee. And after that, so Edward will give a talk about his presentation, about his book. And afterwards, we will have a short 5 minutes or so response to this, yeah, by Moshe Vardi. So I will introduce the speakers as they come, and at the end I will introduce the rest of the panel. So Professor Edward Lee is at the University of California at Berkeley. He's actually the Robert S. Pepper Distinguished Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. And he is, as you can gather, the author of this new and very interesting book that I read, and where several of the questions in the later panel discussions will, on which several of the questions are based. He is a fantastic researcher with an excellent and incredible track record in computer science research, and I will not mention all this because then we could take an hour. It would take us an hour. And so in a similar way, I will not mention all the research successes of the single panelists, but I want just to say Professor Lee is also the principal investigator of the Ptolemy project, modeling, simulation, and design of concurrent real-time embedded systems, the director of the 9 University TerraSwarm Research Center. TerraSwarm, you can already imagine what that means. He is the director of the iSci-Fi Industrial Cyber-Physical Systems Center. So these are all research centers, but he's also the founder of a company called BDTI, Berkeley Design Technologies, Inc., which does consulting for the industry. And if you look at these pages, you can see that major companies are asking for advice there and for projects. So this is also a big success. So I really admire you, how you can do so many things at once, writing interesting books, doing top-level, absolute top-level research, and at the same time founding a company and directing several research centers. So that's really admirable. And I would now like to ask you to give a presentation of your book.
Thank you, Georg. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm actually not used to talking at this level. In fact, this book is my first attempt at a book for a general audience. I've written several textbooks before that are very technical, and no one ever asked me to come talk about them. So this is a little bit of a new experience. But let me just give you a little bit of background. I mean, part of the reason that I set out to write this book is that at Berkeley, we've been under a lot of pressure because of major changes in computer science and a lot of pressure from the society around us. Huge numbers of students coming to take our classes, and a lot of interest in our subject, and also a lot of hype and a lot of fear about what's going on, because I think probably most of you who are here know that, you know, we're in the midst of some pretty big changes. We certainly see signs of it. I mean, you probably know about Vladimir Putin's speech to some million plus starting school children just last September, where he talked about artificial intelligence, and he said, you know, whoever becomes leader in artificial intelligence will become the ruler of the world. And in a sort of similar vein, well, maybe not similar, a more dystopian vein, Elon Musk has been talking about how AI represents an existential threat to humanity, and he's calling for regulation. And one of the questions that I'm trying to address, I'm trying to get, in some ways with this book, a conversation going to improve our understanding of what's actually happening, because I feel like establishing regulations about things that you don't understand is usually not a very good idea. And so I think we need to develop this understanding and have the conversation before we can talk about regulations. So one of the questions that's driving the fear about AI, I think, is the question of whether artificial intelligence will exceed human intelligence. And I think this question is very difficult to answer, because we have to define human intelligence in order to answer it, and I think that's not an easy thing to do. So there's a much easier question that we can ask, however, which is, will machines exceed humans? And I think probably everyone in this room will know that the answer to that question is obviously yes. In fact, they already have. They have for many years. I think that what is scaring people these days is that the machines are now starting to exceed humans in dimensions that are a little bit unexpected, that are more about the cognitive functions of humans and less about the physical functions of humans and the precision with which we can do things. And so that's a natural change. But, you know, in terms of cognitive functions, you know, I have a machine right here in my pocket that can remember far more phone numbers than I can, plus quite a lot more. It, you know, can find information much more easily. In fact, I have right here essentially a gateway to everything humans have ever published, which I can conjure up in this little box. And when I worked at Bell Labs in the early 80s, I learned a bit about the history in Bell Labs, and long before I was there in the 1950s, when they were starting to develop the direct dial phone system, they did all these human studies to try to ascertain how many numbers a person could keep in short-term memory. Turns out the answer is 7. And so that's why they established 7-digit phone numbers in the US. And of course, that didn't scale very well, so they had to add area codes later on. But the hope was that you didn't have to remember the area code because they were going to be localized, and now that's kind of broken down, so nobody remembers numbers anymore. This device remembers them for us. So this device is actually kind of an extension of my personal human cognitive function, and it provides me with a service that really enhances my cognitive function. So really what I'm talking about in this book is trying to understand the part of this evolutionary process that we're going through right now, so that's the essence of the book. So I think the subtitle of the book is really fairly descriptive about what the basic theme is. It talks about the creative partnership of humans and technology, and this image, which I created, that's actually my hand. It's using the help of a little bit of software, again, enhancing my cognitive artistic capabilities. The software that I used was able to make it, render it to look like a drawing, right? But it wasn't actually me putting charcoal or pencil on paper. It was software enhancing my artistic skills. But the essence of this image is really, obviously this is drawn from an Escher, a very famous Escher drawing, which shows two human hands drawing each other. But in this case, it's very important that the other hand is a robotic hand, and it's really talking about a coevolutionary process between humans and technology, where in fact the humans are creating technology, but the technology is also in a very fundamental way creating the humans, in the sense that it has a really profound effect on our culture, and our mental capabilities and cognitive functions. Now, the title of the book is Plato and the Nerd, and the publisher hated this title. They tried to talk me out of it, and I brainstormed with them on quite a lot of alternative titles, and we never really came up with anything that worked. But the title is very indicative, and I'd like to just take a minute to explain it. It's trying to put into opposition two key ideas about how truth and knowledge come about. So the Platonic idea, represented by Plato, is that facts and truths about the world exist independent of humans in some Platonic heaven, and they're just waiting there for humans to discover them. And so the ultimate cognitive function that humans can do is to discover those truths that exist in the Platonic heaven. And if you think of artificial intelligence as one of those discovery processes, we're just trying to discover the processes of intelligence, then in some sense we abdicate responsibility for the results, because those truths already exist in that Platonic heaven, independent of us. And if we don't discover them today, our competing academics will discover them tomorrow, and therefore we're not responsible for the facts and truths that emerge at all. They exist independent of us. All we're doing is revealing them to humans. The opposing idea, represented by the nerd, is that facts and truths are actually created by humans, by our human cognitive function, and that in fact that process of creation can be quite quirky and idiosyncratic and can reflect the personalities of the individuals involved, and that you can create knowledge out of nothing. And if you buy that idea, then you absolutely cannot abdicate responsibility for the outcome of those ideas. And so the essence of this title is to try to put those two different views about knowledge head to head, and then start a conversation about which of those is involved to what degree in the development of technology. Now, a big part of that tension is a tension also between science and engineering, because I was brought up with a very strongly scientific education, and the Platonic view, I think, was really driven into me, where valuing discovery was really what it was all about. And the engineering side, which is the more represented by the nerd, is about creating things that never before existed in any Platonic heaven or anywhere else. So the book confronts this question about, what is the relationship really between science and engineering? And the book talks quite a bit about this LIGO project, the Laser Interferometry Gravitational Observatory. And I didn't know when the book was finished that these guys would get the Nobel Prize for this book. Rainer Weiss at MIT and two of his colleagues at Caltech just got the Nobel Prize a couple of months ago. And I want to read you the citation for the Nobel Prize. It says, it's for decisive contributions to the LIGO detector and the observation of gravitational waves. And one of the interesting things about that citation is that it doesn't mention discovery. And in fact, if you think about it, the LIGO detector is really a magnificent piece of engineering. It is an extremely sensitive instrument that can measure changes in distance over a 4-kilometer range of a small fraction of the diameter of a proton. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of engineering. And I believe that actually this might be the first Nobel Prize citation that actually overtly acknowledges that. It's for decisive contributions to the LIGO detector, an engineered artifact rather than a discovery. Now, if I were to ask most of you in the room, most of you in the room would, if I ask you when was the transistor discovered, you would say, well, it was discovered in the late 1940s at Bell Labs by these guys, Brattain, and Shockley. And they actually got the Nobel Prize in 1956. And their citation read, for the discovery of the transistor effect. Now, as far as I know, the transistor effect has never been found in nature. So they seem to have discovered something that didn't exist. But interestingly, if you dig into the history, this fellow, Julius Lilienfeld, who everyone has forgotten, was issued a patent in 1930 for the field effect transistor. He didn't call it that, but it is a field effect transistor. You can dig out the patent, you can look at it, it's a field effect transistor. He first invented it in 1925. But you don't get a Nobel Prize for inventions, and you don't get a patent for discoveries. So the transistor was actually invented 20 years before it was discovered. That's a little bit curious, okay? So there's an interesting relationship here between science and engineering that I think is a bit subtle and isn't immediately obvious. So one of the epiphanies that I got in working on this book was this observation that scientists and engineers both use models intensively. It's all about models. In science, the value of a model lies in how well it describes a physical system. This is what scientists do. They create models to describe the physical system, and the model is good if it describes that physical system well. But in engineering, the value of a physical system lies in how well its behavior matches that of a model. If I give you a piece of silicon that doesn't realize this logic diagram of my circuit, then that piece of silicon is junk, okay? These are very complementary uses of models, and most people who use models, both in science and engineering, don't really realize which of the ways they're using models. But these are two very different uses of models. So put another way, a scientist asks, can I make a model for this thing? An engineer asks, can I make a thing for this model? Another manifestation of this contrast is that a scientist tries to shrink the number of relevant models, the ones that are needed to explain the physical world. An engineer tries to grow the number of relevant models, the models for which we can build physical systems. These are very different uses, and they're very complementary. Now, my book then goes into the question of whether engineering and science are rational, systematic, and logical. And here I'm going to quote Donald Rumsfeld, which I don't do very often. I think most of you know that he was Department of Defense Secretary during the Iraq War, and he talked about, well, there are the known unknowns, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. I'm a digital guy, and so my immediate observation is that there's a missing fourth category, which is the unknown knowns, right? These are the things you know, but you don't know you know them, okay? These form an enormous part of most of our intellectual activity. And I think the person who best articulated that was another Berkeley professor, Thomas Kuhn, who used the word paradigm in the context of sciences for these unknown knowns. They're part of the backdrop of your thinking, but you're really largely unaware that they're even there, and you're certainly unaware of how much they're shaping your thinking. This happens in technology extremely strongly. A lot of what we think of as very objective aspects of technology are not actually objective at all. They're the results of human creativity. If you think about the design of a chip, you can start with extremely tiny transistors. This is a picture of a transistor that was made one floor down from my office in Corey Hall in Berkeley in our microlab in 2001. It's a FinFET transistor with a 20 nanometer gate width, okay? Extremely small transistor. The transistors that are made on the fabs at Intel these days are about the same dimension, okay? Many years later, this has gotten commercialized. But there's many layers of abstraction between that transistor and that chip. So this die image shows an Intel Haswell chip that has 1.4 billion transistors in an area that is smaller than 2 centimeters squared. And those 1.4 billion transistors can switch 2 billion times per second. So the dynamic range between the single transistor, the single switch, and that hugely complex chip is so big that human designers would not be able to grapple with this complexity of design without many layers of abstraction between the switching transistor and that larger system. And so my claim is that each of those layers of abstraction is actually a human creative artifact, And many times it reflects the quirkiness of the humans. And this is particularly viewed when you elevate this to the software level, where you start to see real personalities emerging, okay? Very idiosyncratic stuff that can take the form of programming languages, for example. And many of these are languages that are extremely widely used, and if you can almost do a anthropology of languages, studying how in fact they came to be the way they came to be. So my book emphasizes in part this sort of quirky creative process that is really not the sort of objective, dispassionate thing that many people think engineering is. And I also talk about this idea that technology is actually co-evolving with humans in a very Darwinian way. And that observation I actually first got from George Dyson's book. So George Dyson is the son of Freeman Dyson, who's a famous physicist. George is not quite as famous, but he wrote this really wonderful book called Turing's Cathedral, where he talks about this coevolutionary process between software technologies and humans. And one of the quotes from his book is he talks about, the big computer, talking about actually these Google server farms, is doing everything in its power to make life as comfortable for its human symbionts. The humans are taking care of developing that software, and the software is taking care of the humans to enable them to further develop the software, okay? So that idea of a symbiosis is what ultimately inspired this cover image, of course. And just to try to entice you to read my book, here's a little quote from it, where it asks a question about artificial intelligence specifically. Are we playing God, creating a new life form in our image? Or are we being played by a Darwinian evolution of a symbiotic new species? Are humans the purveyor of the noisy channel of mutation, facilitating sex between software beings by recombining and mutating programs into new ones? This is what most programmers do, is they take a bit of code from here, a bit of code from there, and they glue it together, and they make a new bit of code, okay? Most of the code that they create then goes and dies, but some of it procreates and mutates into other code, okay? Very Darwinian kind of process that's happening there. Now, my book has kind of a yin and yang part to it, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but again, just to entice you, there's a whole section, the second half of the book is more about what computers can't do than about what they can do, and here's a few of the characters that appear in that part of the book, ranging from Pierre-Simon Laplace, the physicist John Archibald Wheeler, the Reverend Thomas Bayes, Alan Turing, of course, and Claude Shannon. So closing, about artificial intelligence, are we trying to replicate human intelligence? Do we want, in fact, computers replicating human intelligence? I personally do not want to have to argue with my car about getting to school on time. It's hard enough to have that argument with my daughter. I think that it's not even desirable, whether it's achievable or not, right? And moreover, I don't believe it's what's happening. We're actually not creating human-like intelligence. We're creating intelligences that are really quite different from human intelligence. I also talk about this observation in the book. I saw this accident, and my immediate reaction was that car should be ashamed of itself. It was a relatively new car. There is no excuse for putting cars on the road that will do that, okay? There really is no excuse today. And yet we're still doing it. And the reason that we're doing it is for cultural reasons. The car manufacturers, I asked people at Ford, executives at Ford, why do they do this? I mean, this car was actually equipped with a adaptive cruise control system, so it had all the hardware to apply the brakes before colliding into the system in front, but the adaptive cruise control system wasn't turned on. And, the executives at Ford say, well, the liability laws and all this, there's all these cultural issues, right? And so this culture is very tightly intertwined with the technology, and it really can't be separated from the technology. Culture and technology are evolving together, and we need to understand that process better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. Sounds extremely interesting. I mean, I can confirm it is extremely interesting, this book. Now, we have touched upon some philosophical issues here. And if you go to a conference on philosophy, whenever there's a speaker, unlike conferences in computer science, whenever there's a speaker, there's a respondent. And so we have taken over this tradition from philosophy here for today only, and we have a brief respondent, but respondent doesn't mean, a response to a talk doesn't mean to criticize the talk, it means to say some additional stuff based on it. And so I would like to ask Moshe Vardi to give a brief response, and now let me introduce Moshe Vardi to those who do not yet know him. Moshe is a professor of computer science at Rice University. He's actually the Karen Ostrom Georg Distinguished Professor in Computational Engineering. And before taking on his profession at Rice University, he was working as a researcher at Almaden Research Lab, IBM Almaden Research Lab. He is a pioneer in logic and complexity. He did excellent work on computer-aided verification, etc., etc. He helped Intel, so he has worked also with the industry, apart from IBM. Until recently, he was the editor-in-chief of communications of the ACM, and he made this journal, which was becoming what is rather boring, again of interest to the community. And if you now like to read CACM, that's Moshe's merit. Moshe, in addition to his brilliant research and other activities, is also engaged in questions of social impact, of the social impact of computing. And so he writes articles and he deals very much with the question about what happens to jobs when computing is taking them over. So he recently wrote an article in The Guardian, I think. Are robots going to steal our job? Probably. So we will deal with this later, but now please respond to Edward.
Thank you. So I'm going to take off from really almost the last sentence that we heard from Edward. And I'm going to try to summarize the whole book by one phrase: technology is culture, and in particular, software is culture. And on one hand, if you've read a little bit about technology, I'm a philosopher, Heidegger has written about technology, then it's kind of obvious that technology is culture. But I think this observation that you can say is either obvious, but it's also profound. And I think in particular, we technologists have not thought deeply enough about the implication of this observation. So take, for example, here we have, there are now discussion in the faculty here to establish Center for Technology and Society. And typically we think about it, we should study how technology impacts society. But part of what coming from this observation is that we need to start thinking also how society impacts technology. It is not as if technology happens in, so to speak, in Platonian space and then impact society. Society also impacts technology. In particular, that means that it needs to argue against what some people call technological determinism. Just because something could happen, it should happen. Which, if you find, the people who are called the singularitarians, who believe in singularity, take this, it could happen, so it should happen, as if we have no agency, as if society has no agency. And it also, to me, means that we need, in computer science, to see thinking more about social science. Now, you find some social science in computer science. There's a whole field called HCI. And it's something you think of it, I think of it simplistically somewhat, as computer science, interface between computer science and psychology. But we have not thought much about the interface between computer science and sociology. What is the mutual influence that we have between computer science and sociology? And you can find in some places a subject called cultural studies. And one outcome of this is that maybe we need to develop a field called software cultural studies that look at software as a culture and study it from cultural study perspective. Now, in some sense, I would say our model of as computer science for the past 50 years we viewed ourselves as idiot savants, which is we know one thing. We know how to write programs and develop algorithms and build computing systems. We are generally ignorant about people. In fact, we got into computer science because we like machines and we don't like people so much. And maybe we need to do something about that. So for example, I've never taken a course in HCI. And I think in many computer science departments, if you say HCI, human computer interface, should be mandatory course, there will be huge objections to it in a typical place, I think. But maybe we need to rethink it. But we're also ignorant about society. And maybe we need, some places, maybe there is some course on computer ethics, but a deeper understanding of the mutual influence of technology and society is something that's very far from what we have. And I want to tell you where it has brought us. So here is a quote from an article by Peggy Noonan. Peggy Noonan is a famous columnist for the Wall Street Journal. She's well-known, somewhat conservative columnist. She was a speechwriter of Ronald Reagan. And recently she wrote an article about US gun culture. And I think her analysis is completely off base, but it doesn't matter. I want to quote what she's saying. She's trying to explain why people in the United States feel they need to have guns because they're afraid. What are they afraid of? Let's read it. Because all of their personal and financial information got hacked in the latest breach, because our country's real overlords are in Silicon Valley and appear to be moral Martians who operate on some new postmodern ethical wavelengths, and they will be the ones programming the robots that soon will take their job. So our idiot savantness have brought us to the situation now that if maybe until 2-3 years ago, people view Silicon Valley as a cool place with lots of innovation and gadget, this is kind of now going to be the more common view of Silicon Valley as an evil place with Martian overlords. So I think coming back to this point of view that technology and software technology in particular is culture should bring us into new re-evaluation of our technology and society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moshe. We are now starting the panel discussion, and later there will be hopefully a lot of time for the discussion with the floor, for your questions. So let me now introduce the other panelists. So let me maybe start from here. Please come, take a seat. Carlo Ghezzi is professor at the Politecnico di Milano in Italy. He is a professor and chair of software engineering. He was editor-in-chief until recently of ACM Transactions on Software Engineering and Methodology, author of a book together with one of our former colleagues, Mehdi Jazayeri, called Programming Language Concepts. He got the 2008, in 2008 he got an ERC award, self-managing situated computing, and he was the past director of Informatics Europe. That's for those from the Americans, this is corresponds to the CRA in the United States, Computing Research Association. It's the European similar association. And he's now in a long-term collaboration with Beijing University. Then Nadia. Nadia Magnenat-Thalmann. She is both at the University of Geneva in Switzerland and at the Nanyang Technological University, NTU, better known as NTU to us, in Singapore, where she got a huge program grant of $12 million approximately. True? Oh, am I saying secrets here? Yeah. She is working in in human-computer automation, and she's producing humanoids, robots that have the form that look like humans and speak and behave like humans. And she's also the founder of Mira Lab, together with her husband, which is a big lab in Geneva where these humanoids are studied and produced. She pioneered the modeling of realistic virtual humans. And one of the last is Nadine, so she is Nadia, and there is Nadine. Nadine is a humanoid that is basically herself, a kind of copy of herself, a virtual copy of herself, but not only virtual, because it's physically, it's a robot. And it's really fantastic what Nadine can achieve and what Nadia achieved with Nadine. And I really invite you to go to Nadia's webpage and to look at this. There are movies about all these humanoids. But she has been working on that for a long time, so she actually produced the first simulation of a 3D version of Marilyn Monroe, which entered in the film Rendezvous in Montreal, or Rendezvous in Montreal in 1987. She showed her work at the Modern Art Museum in New York in 1988, along with Canadian computer artists, and she is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Visual Computer. The Visual Computer. Moshe Vardi. Moshe Vardi and Edward Lee were already introduced. And then we have finally Professor Hans Akkermans from the Vrije University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He is Professor of Business Informatics and founding director of the Network Institute. That's an institute that deals with social sciences, humanities, and relates them to computing and social sciences and humanities, so an interdisciplinary institute with about 300 researchers coming from various disciplines and working together. Professor Akkermans' main interests are in knowledge engineering, engineering ontologies and social networks, and many more, but I mean, these are maybe the few main research interests that you have. He is also the director of the W4ARA, the Web Alliance for Regreening Africa. So he's very engaged also in a real, something which one would not think that a computer scientist necessarily has to do, but actually you try to make computers and the web and the internet help regreening Africa, which is a very interesting thing and a very good cause, of course. And I think that's it for the moment, and we could start our discussion. I have prepared 4 questions to our panel. We will have these 4 questions, and then we have the general discussion. Okay? So my first question is the following. It's about determinism, because one important part that you couldn't bring over today too much, we couldn't speak too much about it today, is determinism, non-determinism in your book. Now, you say a model is deterministic if it is not possible for it to react in 2 or more ways to the same conditions. Determinism is a very interesting idea and is a very interesting feature. Now, determinism is also a philosophical feature. There's a philosophical doctrine that says the world is deterministic. The world is completely deterministic. This doctrine can be, in a certain sense, misused. So there's a very famous example that a criminal, a murderer, stands in front of the judge, and as his excuse, he says, well, you know, the world is deterministic. I couldn't have acted differently. I'm determined, so I'm not guilty. And the judge immediately says, well, yeah, you're completely right, I understand you. But I'm a judge, I'm determined, I'm completely determined, and I have to convict you, and I have to give you a life sentence. So you see where determinism leads to. But determinism and non-determinism is also very important in computing. And so let me start to, this is a more technical question. The next questions will be maybe a little bit more of general interest, but we are also computer scientists, so we want to know what's the role of determinism? So maybe I can start with Nadia. Nadine. Is Nadine deterministic? If I ask her the same question under the same circumstances, would she respond the same thing or not?
Well, if we see humanoid robots today, you have some where we have predefined questions. I mean, like everybody has heard of Sofia, who get citizenship in Saudi Arabia, for example. And many interviews are done in a question and answer session where everything is predetermined. So in this case, determinism is in a reality. I mean, it's a practical reality. But if I see Nadine, let's say how she is built up, you can also leave Nadine react freely. So if she has an annotated database and her personal database, and then somebody asks a question and triggers through the question something that in fact she will search. When I say she, of course she's a computer, but let's say she's embodied in a human shape. So she will search something on her own. And what is interesting, to answer your question, Nadine was at the Art Science Museum in Singapore, and she has met more than 100,000 people. And most of the case, she didn't repeat the same way. I mean, it depends how you ask. And if the database, annotated database, and her own database and is very broad enough, and we have AI models that, let's say, she can recognize and work on all these different modules, she will have a behavior which is non-deterministic. So as a human, we don't know automatically what she will say.
Thank you very much. So this is a very important point, because there's one view of determinism that says non-determinism comes from complexity. There's such a huge complexity with hidden parameters, and at the end, we don't know all these hidden parameters. So for us, non-determinism means the system is just, we don't know all the details, and so to us it seems non-deterministic. But now let's have maybe another view on non-determinism by Moshe, who has dealt very often with non-deterministic complexity classes like NP and non-deterministic exponential time, etc. So what's determinism for you in your work and life?
So the issue of non-determinism goes to one of the most deepest philosophical questions, which is the question of free will. So most of us have a sense that we make decisions as autonomous agents, and I can decide to scratch my left ear or my right ear, and it's purely my choice. And it's further understood, and that's what you're relating to, that free will is required for us to have moral agency. If we are just automata, when we have an autonomous car that causes an accident, we're not going to go put the autonomous car on trial, right? We understand that it's just an automaton, and we'll go to the people who develop the software and say, why did the car have an accident? So we behave as if we have free will. Physicists argue, no, there's no free will. They agree that they believe the universe behaves in a deterministic way. When non-deterministic is generalized to the level of the wave function, which determines the probability of events, but still it defines the universe, they define mechanically, right? We have equations govern the behavior of the universe. So it seems that free will is actually an illusion, and there are lots of studies. One can go on a long time to talk just about, the illusion. It turns out it's a useful illusion. People that believe they have free will behave more morally than people who don't believe they have free will. Now, of course, in computer science, we use a lot non-determinism. It's considered one of the in fact, the Turing Award for Rabin and Scott were given for their introduction of non-determinism. And it's a very powerful modeling tools because it enables us to reason about things that we don't know precisely. There's too much unknown about the system. We cannot even assign probabilities. And when we build a non-deterministic model, it gives us a range to reason about the best case and about the worst case. So, but it's purely, in some sense, a technical device. It's a very powerful technical device.
Carlo?
For me, non-determinism is a way to express uncertainty that you have about some kind of phenomenon. And I've been dealing with this in the case of building software systems that interact with an environment that you don't fully understand or which may change. And in that case, actually, I don't know whether non-determinism is something that is intrinsic in the real world or not, but operationally, what I can do is to try to understand the behavior through some kind of probabilistic modeling and learning of what is going on in the environment with which the system is interacting, and try to build a system that can deal with behaviors that are initially unknown or become more known as you are interacting with the rest of the system. So treating the system as a probabilistic system is a way of reducing non-determinism to something that you can analyze, predict, reason about, and react in some predictable manner when you build the system.
Thank you. Any further comment on this? Yes.
So I'd like to just repeat the quote from my book, right, which says that a model is deterministic if it's not possible for it to react in two or more ways to the same conditions. The word model is extremely important in that sentence. And in fact, there's a principle that I talk about in the book. In fact, I call it the Kopets principle because I first learned it from Professor Herman Kopets, who is now emeritus from here. What I learned from Professor Kopets was that a lot of the properties that we talk about physical systems are actually not properties of the physical system at all, but rather are properties of the model of the physical system. And in fact, the same physical system, given two different models, could be both deterministic and non-deterministic. And in fact, quantum mechanics is a good example of that. If you define the state of a system as the position and momentum of the particles, then it's non-deterministic. If you define the state of the system as its wave equation, then it's deterministic because it evolves according to Schrödinger's equation, which is a deterministic evolution of the wave function. So the same system can be viewed as deterministic or non-deterministic depending on the model you construct. And the second point is that determinism does not imply predictability because many deterministic models are chaotic, which means that they're infinitely sensitive to initial conditions and assumptions that you have about parameters. And consequently, having a deterministic model does not necessarily mean that you have a predictable behavior. And then the third point I'd like to make is that deterministic models have historically proved unbelievably useful in engineering. I mean, I would say, the whole Industrial Revolution is built on our ability to write down differential equations that describe dynamics of mechanical systems, and the differential equations themselves are deterministic. Is the system deterministic? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows, but it doesn't matter. Those deterministic models are extremely useful, and they can even be used to analyze the robustness of the system, to analyze, for example, stability under uncertainty about parameter values and things like that. So that's an example of deterministic models that have proved useful. In computer science, we rely very heavily on the fact that a single-threaded imperative program is deterministic in the sense that you start it with some initial conditions, you give it some arguments, it will produce a result, and the program defines a single behavior. Now, of course, that's a model. I could give you a different model of that same program that describes the execution of the program as electrons sloshing in silicon, and that model is probably not going to be deterministic, but it's really describing the same system. So determinism really is a property of models and not a property of the physical world. And in my book, I treat it that way, and I completely circumvent these philosophical questions of free will by doing that.
Yeah, I think this is an important point. Determinism is a kind of ideology, and actually I have a background in physics myself. Worked on nuclear reactions. Maybe you are familiar with the neutron bomb. I worked on reactions with neutrons like that. There are, as Edward says, there are different levels of description because reality is really complex. So one idea is to model all these particles and see what they do. That can be in principle, a deterministic description in the classical sense. It's already much more difficult when you do it in a quantum mechanical sense. Then you lose this simple deterministic idea. If you go to a different kind of model, which you typically do in large-scale systems, you define certain aggregate properties and you get into probabilistic models, stochastic models, for example, like random walks or master equations. So this idea of determinism is really a property of the models you have, and different models of the same system can be deterministic or precisely non-deterministic at the same time. And it has nothing to do with what the real system does, but that is typically the claim with a lot of, let's say, traditional positivistic scientists.
Thank you. Something comes into my mind. Non-deterministic models are sometimes simpler. Yeah? They help us to simplify a question. If you look at a non-deterministic automaton, yeah, it has few states, and then you want to make a deterministic automaton out of it, and you have an exponential and blow up. So this shows also that it's really the model that counts here, because these automata, of course, are all models, and you could have of the same physical thing, two models, so it is consistent with what you say, deterministic model and non-deterministic one, but in this case, the deterministic model is actually more complex, so has more states, and is much more difficult to understand for humans sometimes. Okay, let me come to the second questions. The second question is, many decisions regarding individuals are nowadays made by AI, by deep learning programs, machine learning, and other AI programs. For example, decisions about creditworthiness. All the agencies who decide whether you are creditworthy or not, they use machine learning. And I have a personal case here, because I live in the UK, in Austria, and in Italy. I have a lot of credit cards. And on most of my credit cards, I have a credit limit of about 10,000 pounds or euros. And on one credit card in the UK, I have only 500 pounds. So I was very angry, because this was a very good credit card, actually. It has low rates and low fees, etc. So this was the post office credit card. So I phoned them. I phoned the post office up, or the credit card bank up, and they said, well, you know, we didn't do that. We outsourced this to a credit rating agency. Okay, so they gave me the phone number of the agency. So I phoned them up, and I had to identify myself, etc. And then they said, well, you know, I asked them, so why do I have only 500? They said, well, we use the best machine learning program. You believe us, we use the best, absolutely best machine learning program. But I said, well, so how did that come? I mean, I have a decent salary, and I never had was in breach of anything, so I never had any problems. So how come that you give me only 500? And I had to insist and insist and insist, and eventually they came back to me and said, well, it must be related to where you live. So I had bought a house at that time, yeah? And in the same house there was a tenant. Before I moved in, there was a tenant of the former owner. And this tenant never paid his bills. So how did I know it? Because for years I got these unpaid bills afterwards. Yeah? And so basically they had a machine learning program that decided if you live in the same household as somebody who doesn't pay their bills, then also you are unlikely to pay your bills. Okay? So this is a very reasonable rule. Ethically, it's maybe not, it's debatable, of course, but it's a reasonable rule, no? But it was applied to completely wrong data. But they didn't know that. They couldn't know it. They couldn't know that this tenant has moved out because in England there is no obligation to tell anybody if you move out. Yeah? Not like here where you have to move to tell to the police, I'm no longer living here, or like in Switzerland. In England it's completely free and you don't have to tell anybody. So these programs just assume, yeah, that the people, the last state of knowledge, yeah, if the last state of knowledge is this person lives there. So this was just an example. And such a thing should actually no longer happen because with effect from 2018, the EU, well, the UK will no longer be in the EU, but at least in the EU it should not happen. Yeah? With effect from 2018, the EU's new General Data Protection Regulation will give individuals a right to explanation. So it's no longer that you can say, yeah, what happened, etc. They have to give it. But this, of course, creates a lot of challenges. And so, Carlo, maybe.
Okay, I thought I was talking about 3, but I discovered that it doesn't matter. So I will, yes. I believe that it's a fundamental right of a citizen, in many cases, to know the why, and not only the final result of a decision. And so whenever you're using a mechanism like, these algorithms that are kind of black box, so they provide no explanation of the results that are found for certain kind of decisions, I think that should not happen. You gave an example, which is, in your case, the credit card. But it's well known that, systems of this kind are increasingly used, for example, for law enforcement or for judging about, people in trials. So I think that as a citizen, you need to know why. You just don't need to know, as I said, what is the final result of something that doesn't explain to you, tracing back, to the reasons of the social contract that you subscribed as a citizen, why these things happened. So, in some sense, what I believe is that the right to know the why becomes, if you want, the duty for researchers to actually build into these systems not only the algorithms that, based on data provide these results, but the ability to explain. And again, we go back to the models. Models are a way to explain, through some kind of abstraction that, provides the ability for the person, the citizen, to make to understand, what is going on behind the scenes, to be able to explain the why. And this is, of course, requires in many areas a research that is not there yet. So the need for this definitely will prompt research to do that.
Thank you. Yes, there is actually an area of AI which is called XAI, explainable AI, which deals with it, but unfortunately they're not very far. So it's not really, nobody knows how now if you have a deep neural network, to give a precise explanation. So there are a lot of challenges. You want to say something maybe?
First of all, I think in your case, maybe a bug of the system, maybe not mature enough, because what I believe, of course, every citizen should know how a decision is proposed by, let's say, a robot or whatever, a machine. This is obvious, but I also think that, we will not accept a decision coming like that. If I have a tool, in your very interesting example, you said that finally you took another credit card. So in some way, you know, the people will lose business if they propose some black box and people don't understand. Even this black box make errors, so we will find something else. So I think there will be a rejection if people don't understand. This is the same with a relationship with a robot. Of course, if a robot is pretty much humanoid, the robot can explain, like a human, how he or she comes to the conclusion to say this or that. So there is an interaction, very natural, that can happen more than if you go with a credit card, you need immediately to get the money or something. You don't like to have a big explanation or deep learning, yes?
So can I say to Nadine, why did you say that? Why do you say that? Yes. Will there be a reasonable answer or some blah blah?
Nadine is the developer. She doesn't solve any problem, but this is an area of research we developed that she explained what she is and out of which model, which in some way is easy because it is a computer, so a computer can explain the detail of the functioning. So that's no problem. At least it's like a tutorial or a MOOC for Nadine to explain. So I think over time I'm not so much worried that we will be a victim of decision done, in this case, by computers, because we will reject it. I think most society will reject.
So let's imagine the following scenario. I come to the legal system and I say, I have a dog. And I train the dog to tell whether people are lying or not. I train the dog, and the dog can smell and very sensitive. And the first they laugh, and then they really test and bring lots of test cases. And the dog is always right. Well, I think there was a story about a German horse called Hans the Wise. The dog is, nobody is able to catch the dog in error. The dog seems to be really very accurate. And I've now proposed that whenever there is a trial, you should have the dog. And if the dog barks, then it means the person is lying. If the dog sits down, the person is telling the truth. Will we accept to make a legal judgment based on the dog? And we tested the dog. Will people say, okay, this is okay. We're going to now decide who is guilty and who is innocent based on a dog. And most people said, you must be kidding, right? I mean, no way we are going to accept that the judgment of a dog will have consequential outcomes for people. It's just a dog. And somehow, because now we call this dog a robot, we are willing to take this kind of machines, this kind of, what is a dog? I can say dog is some kind of deep learning system. And now we're letting them make decisions for humans. So the real issue is not whether I can explain itself or not, in my opinion. We need to have a deeper conversation. What decisions that have consequences for humans, significant consequences, would we allow them to be made by machines? And you have to understand, this is your decision you're describing, it's just about credit card. That's one of the lightweight decisions. Now we're talking about decisions to separate children from their family. Forget about
So I think this is a great research area. I think explainable AI is a topic that I find absolutely fascinating, and I think that there's a lot of potential actually for AIs to be much better than humans at this. Humans, interestingly enough, are actually very good at coming up with explanations for their decisions, but psychologists know that often those explanations are actually wrong. There's this wonderful book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he talks about quite a few experiments. I wish I could remember the details of some of these experiments, but they're cleverly constructed experiments that have humans make decisions, and then they construct a scenario where they then ask the human to explain how they arrived at this decision, and the explanations that the humans come up with are demonstrably not possibly what could have led to those decisions. So there's a lot of sort of post facto rationalization, and in fact, Daniel Kahneman's basic thesis is that the human brain is an interaction between two subsystems that operate in very different ways, that we call them the system 1 and the system 2, one of which is operating in a very intuitive, quickly reactive way, and the other one is the one that manages our notion of self and our conscious reasoning. And he says that the conscious reasoning system will come up with explanations post facto for decisions that were made by the first system that they cannot, those cannot have actually been the reasons. So I think that it's a bit misleading to be trusting humans' explanations of their decisions. And we all know that humans have a lot of very hidden biases. A judge can give you a perfectly reasoned decision for why he convicted this person, but there's factors that influence that the judge is probably completely unaware of and don't factor into the explanation. So I actually believe that AIs may, if we can do the research well, actually be better at coming up with decisions they can explain.
That is true, but I do not think that you should give away decisions blindly to machines, like with the dog. So I think this is a thing that must be regulated and controlled by humans, based on a societal discussion on what is desirable. And that must be a transparent, political and ethical discussion. Then you can decide what you have in the airline industry or in big transport, that we make the decision that machines can do certain things, and because they do it better, like self-driving cars at some point in time. But it must be a conscious, societal, democratic decisions to move in such directions. And you must be able also to retract these kinds of decisions. And what is happening now is that there is all kinds of things going on under the carpet, and you don't know.
I would just wanted to add something to what Edward said, that even a bad and a biased explanation, at least it is refutable. If I have nothing, no explanation at all, then, what can I say?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with both of these. I think, we need explanations, and they need to be, and the decision-making needs to be human. I think this is why, I honestly prefer to talk about IA, intelligence augmentation, rather than AI. I think that the AI software can actually help us make better decisions if we use it correctly and use it carefully. And hopefully it could be used, for example, to reveal biases to us that exist in our current systems that we're simply unaware of. And to me, that would be a tremendously valuable service to have these intelligence augmentation systems that will reveal to us the biases that are affecting our decision making.
Okay. Now I move to the third question. Edward, in his book, describes the coevolution between the symbiosis of humans and machines. Machines, in particular software, improve through humans, and humans get clever through software, through applications, apps, and whatever, and technology. Symbiotic hybrid systems and conglomerates are formed whose components are both humans and machines. And one nice example is Uber. You can see Uber as one big machine where humans, taxi drivers, human Uber drivers, they get exactly said what they have to do, where they have to go, how they have to drive, and where they have to drive. So a lot of decisions are taken off from them just by a computer. So they are part of a big machinery, which is mainly driven by artificial intelligence or software. Now, my question is it acceptable for a human being to be part of such a machinery, Or more with our Uber example, are taxi drivers happier than Uber drivers? Because they still can make some decisions, they can choose their route.
Oh, yeah, okay, a few comments. I think that there's two problems here. One is this coevolution aspect. In a sense, this has been, said also by, certain research communities, even 30 or 40 years ago. I remember, people talking about software evolution. And the reason why software evolution is that you build a system, the system gets used, it changes the way people behave because of the new system that you provide, and this is giving a feedback to developers who are developing new features, and this has been there since the very beginning of software. So even in the 60s, late 60s, there were people like, Beladi, Lehman, reflecting on software evolution, and they already spoke about this kind of coevolution. Now, what is different today is that, this coevolution, first of all, is affecting humans in their daily life, and it's happening at a much faster pace than before. So the evolution of systems and humans, which required in the late 60s, 70s, maintaining system, changing software, today is happening at a speed that is much higher than it used to be. So this coevolution is really becoming a kind of, I used to say that it used to be something that happened offline. Now this coevolution happens at runtime. So while systems are there, the systems evolve, the humans evolve continuously. So this is something that is there. Now the second part of the question is, are people happy? For example, in this ecosystem like Uber, are these people happier? Actually, I don't know. But I remember I interviewed a Uber taxi driver, and he seemed to be pretty happy to live with this kind of system. What is definitely, I discovered that there's other people that are not happy in many cases, which is the regular taxi drivers. So I discovered that in many countries there is a huge opposition of the others who are not part of the system. And in many cases, this is just due to defending a status that is kind of challenged by this new model. So taxi drivers and let's say the normal business believe that there's a threatening against them, and they feel that they are in danger because this type of evolution is not touching them. So they are left over by a kind of evolution that is going on in the real world, which is successful and is leaving them outside which is something that happens, more and more often today, that, when a change is empowering certain parts of the population, there's others who are in danger. So they become less and less able to live in the world in which they used to live. Perhaps, what we have to be careful about is to observe this phenomena and make sure that, large part of the population by these changes are not left out by the changes that is affecting others.
Yeah, but I interviewed a lot of taxi drivers and said, why don't you become an Uber driver? And they said, well, I'll earn less, and I don't have freedom because the machine tells me whatever I have to do. So it's, of course, they are unhappy about the Uber drivers, about Uber taking a lot of business, but they are also, I think, they're reluctant just to go to Uber, become an Uber driver. This is not the case in Los Angeles, where I was recently in Los Angeles and I didn't see any taxi any longer, so they're only Uber. Very few taxis. If you want a taxi in LA now, you have to go to a hotel. That's the only way to find a taxi.
Let's change the question. Instead of Uber driver, let's talk about Facebook users. Because you can argue the same, that Facebook user behavior is changed by the software. In fact, we know that the Facebook algorithm keeps learning from user. So it's a perfect example of coevolution. And a paper just appeared just very recently in some cognitive science journal that try to explain the rising incidence of depression, suicide attempt, and actual suicides among teenagers in the United States, and try to explain what is happening. And they try to go through several explanations, and the conclusion was combination of social media and smartphone. The fact is that it's always there, and the extensive use of it. So the answer to your question is, it makes us miserable.
Well, I think the co-evolution is a natural process. If we look at the history of humanity, as soon as we had some tool to start with, we have co-evaluate with a tool. For example, with my pencil, something very simple, I can be empowered and I have a relationship. And of course, the more we go with software and particularly in embodiment of humanoid robots in the field in which I am, it's becoming more and more important. Because if you have a humanoid robot always more intelligent, being able to explain and detail and having a relationship, of course, it goes much further. And one point maybe that here is not discussed is we speak always of AI, but let's say we work a lot on emotional relationship. I mean, an interesting experience I have in Singapore, and we had a workshop on that, is that people who live with, let's say, who are in old age, particularly with people with dementia, gave a talk in an open house we had, and it was quite interesting because they wish to have humanoid robots to deal with the patients, because on the long run, they will be the only one available and clever enough to be able to understand the person, the specific needs, to have empathy and to have patience 24 hours. And what I found incredibly interesting is it didn't come from computer scientists. It came from the people who are with this dementia or old age people. When I say old age, some of them are 50 plus. And it is interesting that in the coming future, we will have we will have a mixed society with a very clever, emotional, with empathy robot that will understand maybe better human than a real human can, because a real human, after a while, cannot stay too long. It's unbearable to have this kind of relationship. A robot will have empathy for 24 hours, a memory, and remind how to deal with the person. I don't say it should replace, but what is interesting, we are going to have partners like humanoid robots. When people is not there and the costs are so high in old age, people cannot take care of someone 24 hours on the emotional and the needs, and we will have maybe our best human partners who are humanoid robots. So it will go also in this direction.
Hans has maybe, oh sorry, you want to say something ad hoc?
I do. I can't keep quiet any longer, sorry. One of the principles of a Darwinian evolutionary process is that it involves random mutations, and some of those mutations will be beneficial and some of them will not. And that's, I think you can't have an evolutionary process without the mutations, and you can't ensure that they're all going to be beneficial. And so one of the things that I'm getting at in my book is that we need to understand what's actually happening if we're going to be able to manage this process. And one of the things that we need to understand is happening is that some of the technology evolution is going to produce detrimental artifacts. And in fact, it is possible for evolutionary processes to completely run amok. And, you know, we might have a symbiosis now with these evolving software beings where, you know, they will evolve into beings that don't need the humans anymore. That could in fact happen. That's certainly possible within an evolutionary process. So there's lots of things that could go wrong. My goal is let's understand what's actually happening and not try to delude ourselves that actually we're just doing top-down intelligent design of software systems, and that every screw-up that gets created, like like Facebook causing increase in suicide, is the result of some evil software programmer having done something wrong. That's a complete misrepresentation of what's actually happening. And so my goal is that we need to have this conversation to understand what's actually happening before we can figure out how to manage it.
Given the title of your book, Edward, I would like to bring in Aristotle. For you, Plato is basically the model of the scientist that does discoveries, and the nerd is the model or the metaphor for the engineer who does constructive things and makes things. What is interesting in the book of Aristotle, in Nicomachean Ethics, he discusses, I believe it's book 6, different kinds of knowledge. And what is in modern philosophy and science most well known is what he calls episteme, where we have the word epistemology. But there are more types of knowledge. One important one is what he calls phronesis, which is actually the knowledge how to act. And he does not use that in an engineering sense, but more in a kind of governance sense. And the reason behind it is quite easy to understand. He basically made his living by educating the young, rich, male, adult people from Athens that needed a good education. And one thing was how to run the household, and the other thing was how to run the country properly. And then he brings in a principle in the same book, which he calls eudaimonia, which is usually translated as human flourishing. So your governance must be focused on human flourishing. In later philosophy, in antique Rome, it's often called the good life, not an individual thing, but a social kind of thing. And clearly, these things are discussed in the Agora, where the free men came together to discuss and make all kinds of social and political decisions. So I think that this idea of eudaimonia is quite important in this kind of technology, because it's clear that in this coevolution, as you call it, there are very differential effects on different people. So benefits and damages. And that must be moderated by a societal discussion focused on what is human flourishing.
So the publisher and I briefly considered the title Plato and Aristotle, but then we realized that everyone would think it was an introduction to classical philosophy, which it is not.
Okay, I think this was a very good conclusion of this round. And the next round, given that we don't have that much time, I will mainly address a question to Moshe, who is an expert on this topic. So many jobs are disappearing due to robotics, due to AI. And if we come back to Uber drivers will exist only for for maybe 5 more years or so, and then they will be completely replaced by technology. So basically they are now used as part of a big machinery, but as a disappearing part, they will be squeezed out of this machinery, and programs will replace them. There are several studies that show us which kind of jobs will disappear. So I just mentioned one from ALAX, and there are other studies who are similar. So the 15 disappearing most endangered job categories are drivers, farmers, because of harvesting machines, printers and publishers, that's very good. And finally, Elsevier will disappear, yeah. Moshe is a big fight with Elsevier. Cashiers are already disappearing, yeah. travel agents, manufacturing workers, dispatchers, interestingly, waiters and bartenders. I just cannot imagine that, but that's on their list. Because there's a big the automation now going on also in restaurants and canteens, etc. Military pilots and soldiers, it's maybe not so bad if they disappear. Fast food workers, telemarketers, accountants, tax agents, stock traders, construction workers. Then there are other lists. So for instance, the Oxford Internet Institute has a similar list, but the first place there are librarians. So librarians, according to them, are the first category who will disappear. And I can say, I must be frank, it's 10 years that I have talked to the last librarian probably, because I get everything I want to read, either directly from the web. When it's computer science, you can have direct access, or if it's not computer science, you get it through Amazon and you never go to the library any longer. So this is not true for other people, but for me, I have to say it's a shame. I'm ashamed to say this. So now, how should we react to this? And Moshe has thought a lot about this problem.
People think that this is something that will happen in the future. But it's really not AI that eliminates job, it is technology. And it's been happening really for 50 years. If you look now in the United States, where we have very good data, and you look at working class men, these are people without college education, with at most high school education, between 25 and 54, they're not in school, they're not retired, they're not in prison, they're not in the military. Among these people, you find now that maybe 1 in 4 men is not working. This is pretty shocking. Most of us don't realize it. This is kind of what we consider depression level lack of work. It does not show up in the statistic that you normally hear, because normally you hear about an unemployment measure called U3, and it measures how many people that are looking for a job are not finding a job. And of course, you all realize that there are 2 ways to lower it. More people finding jobs or fewer people looking for jobs. And what we've seen is fewer people looking for jobs. So if you have seen political rallies in the United States over the past year, see a lot of angry men, and we used to see this thing like the Middle East, now you see it in America, men kind of standing and waving their fist, and you want to understand what are they so angry about? So the answer is that not in our world is the world of educated professionals, and in our world, technology is great, but technology has not been kind at all to working class people. And we can see a wave of this continuing, because if you look where the people are going to lose their jobs, you can see, drivers, working class people, mostly men. And a colleague of mine at MIT, Andrew McAfee, had a beautiful phrase. He said, the people will rise before the machine will rise. And if you want to understand what's been happening politically around the world in the last year, really, it's already been happening. The people have risen. And you can see that in the Brexit vote in the United States so far, and we have not seen something so extreme in the continent, but we are seeing it on the continent as well. And so the answer is that technology has huge impact. Now, of course, it's a tautology that technology creates new jobs, except that people are not widgets. You can take a truck driver that lost his job and say, yes, but we have a job for you, writing software for autonomous cars. People are not widgets. And so I view today these issues of the impact of technology on the workforce as one of the biggest technologies the society will have to deal with. And if we're not going to deal with, we can look at precedent in history to tell us what's going to happen.
But what should we do? What should the politicians do?
So this is, the first part. The problem is if you jump too quickly to policy recommendations, every policy recommendation, it's like we are sitting here and we are discussing what the informatics should do, and the International Advisory Board come up with various recommendations, and the answer is, no, sorry, the legal system in Austria does not allow us to do that. And so this is true in many cases. We have a system that has been predicated that people who are willing to work and find jobs, and we are dealing with essentially disrespect for people who are not working. We are giving them maybe a little bit, but what happens if the boundary condition change? This is not the case anymore. We have to revisit what we call the social compact.
almost anything you can think about the framework of work as an institution for us to make a living is a new thing. It's about 100 years old. It was really a reaction to two major events, to the Industrial Revolution and to the Great Depression. As a result of this, we have, and in some sense, the reaction to the Industrial Revolution, so now we're talking about roughly starting in the middle of the 18th century, it took us about 200 years to respond. Only by the 1950s and 60s, we have the final maturation of the modern social welfare state, which is pretty much, with different degrees, is what we see in the Western world, everywhere, even the US, which is less socialized than Europe. It's still a social welfare state. And it really happens finally in the 60s. So hopefully, now if people say, oh, well, we've adapted to Industrial Revolution, wow, that was, if we are going to repeat the last one, think about it. 2 communist revolutions, but 100 million people died in 2 communist revolutions. And so we'll have to rethink, we'll have to rechange societal arrangements, we'll have to start a vigorous debate on what it would be. There are various proposals. There are people are, for example, universal basic income is a proposal floating on the left and on the right, with vehement objections on the left and on the right. So this is not going to be easy, but the sooner we start having this serious conversation, the easier the adjustment will be.
Thank you very much. I think this is a wonderful conclusion. I think we have to finish. The Dean is already looking very angry at me, so thank you very much. Thank you everybody for